Welcome back. In our last little bit of the series, we saw that the situation was crying out for a hero. We saw that there was a massive political and social intrigue going on with stuff straight out of the thriller, with people murdering family and all sorts of different things going on. And we saw that things were ready for a hero to step onto the stage. And at the end of Luke chapter 1, we read that John grew up and became strong in spirit. What often happens with the Bible is we read a little verse like that and we skip over it. And what we don't always realise, or maybe take into account, that between the end of Luke chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3, John is growing up, and it's a 30-year period. And in that 30-year period, we're told that John grew up to become strong in spirit. And that gave me a question. What sort of makes someone like John grow up to be strong? What do we know about John's upbringing, other than he grew up in this sort of culture where the Romans were ruling and the Herods were competing for power against a sort of morally corrupt religious system? What we do know is a few things. We know that Zachariah and Elizabeth lived in the Judean Hills, and so John grew up in the Judean Hills. And the Judean Hills were an area to the south of Bethlehem and Jerusalem. And traditionally we sort of think of that as being a bit of farming country. It now includes the disputed West Bank that we often hear about on the news. But what maybe we didn't quite realise is that the area where we're reading about, the area that John grew up in, includes the area that was the vineyards, the wine-growing region of Israel. In fact, it was referred to as the Bordeaux of ancient times. And so John grew up in a sort of agricultural setting. And it's believed, if you go to Israel today, you can go on a tour and come to a village called Ein Kerem, which is where they believe that John grew up. It's about 3 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Now, I want us to pause for a minute and just reflect something of John's calling, because in Luke chapter 1 and verse 15, do you remember that we were told that John would grow up and he must never drink wine or any alcoholic drink? It's linked in some cases to a bit like a Nazarite vow, which is an Old Testament vow of dedication, of setting apart, of something significant. And in the Bible, it's usually a temporary vow, but there are 3 characters who took a lifelong sort of Nazarite vow. And we know that one of those was Samson, and we know that one of those was Samuel. What do Samson and Samuel have in common with John? All 3 of them were miracle births that resulted in God stepping into a situation where there were barren women who were faithful and crying out to God, and God stepped in. But just for a moment, imagine growing up surrounded by vineyards, potentially growing up working in the vineyards, and not being allowed to touch a drop of wine. You know, we know that John's family were a priestly family and that twice a year they would go up and serve in the temple. But for the rest of the year, growing up in Ein Kerem, they were probably linked to the wine trade. So growing up in an area where you're surrounded by vineyards and surrounded by wine but told you must never touch a drop, we know that that must have taken a lot of discipline. And for people to grow up strong in the Lord, there is a sense of needing that discipline, that sense of training. But we also know it involved choice. John had to make a choice to fulfill that calling, which talks a lot about the training of one's willpower. A lot of what we face in life involves a battle of the mind. And I would imagine that John, growing up surrounded by vines and wine and not touching a drop, would take a lot of willpower. It would take a battle of the mind to succeed. And what we know from all of that is it would have been character forming, character building. No doubt he would have been under peer pressure. You're working in the vineyard, you're working in surrounded by wine, is part of the culture, is part of the everyday social activity. So go on, John, wouldn't really matter. What we see is that growing up in that environment, there was a sacrificial nature of the witness that John must have had. In other words, that vow that he was given before birth to actually put it into practice when he was being tempted every day was very much part of that signpost. It's like standing up with a different spirit, becoming countercultural, and through doing all of that, being able to speak into people's lives and say, this is how you should live. He probably earns the right to do that, as opposed to some of the politics of the day. We all know that we've been through a lockdown over the last 12 months, a pandemic. And one of the things that's been a feature of that is what we've seen some politicians stand up and tell us what we should do and then do something different themselves. And often it's one thing to talk the talk, but it's another to walk the walk. And when we look at John, we see somebody who's walking the walk and earning the right to talk the talk. All of this, for me, develops some questions. Our hero was born as a normal human being. How did he develop his character? How did he grow up to become strong in spirit? And for me, this creates a question that I want to explore over the next couple of weeks, called the nature-nurture debate. What or who influences our lives?